interest. I'd like to see it. Eleanor studied him for a moment, and Harrington saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. Deciding something, weighing options. Very well, she said finally. She produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door. The room was exactly as she described, cluttered with old tools, broken plow blades, coils of rope, empty barrels. Dust lay thick on everything, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. It looked like a space that hadn't been used in years. Harrington walked through it slowly, examining everything, looking for something that might confirm Ruth's suspicions. But there was nothing. No evidence of violence, no signs of recent activity, nothing that suggested this room was anything other than forgotten storage. Satisfied, Eleanor asked from the doorway. Harrington turned to face her, frustrated and uncertain. Everything that told him seemed plausible, but he had no proof, nothing concrete he could take to authorities or publish in the Liberator. Without evidence, he was just another abolitionist making wild accusations about Southern planters. For now, he said. But as they walked back toward the main house, Harrington noticed something odd. The ground near the barn was uneven in places, subtle depressions and rises that suggested the earth had been disturbed at some point. He remembered Ruth's comment about digging and filling. He glanced toward the area she had mentioned, the section where Eleanor claimed she would plant an orchard someday. From a distance, it looked like broadly uncultivated land, rocky and unsuitable for cotton. But there was something about the way the vegetation grew there, patterns that didn't quite match the surrounding areas. That section there, said, pointing. Why haven't you developed it? Poor soil, Eleanor replied immediately. Too rocky for cotton, and I haven't had time to prepare it properly for a orchard. It's on my list of future improvements. Harrington studied the land, trying to determine if his suspicions were justified, or if he was seeing patterns where none existed. Finally, he thanked Eleanor for her time and rode back to Villageville, more uncertain than ever about what was happening at Moss Creek. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the room he had just searched was exactly what Eleanor wanted him to be. A carefully prepared false front. The real room, the one where the work was done, lay beneath it. The trapdoor was concealed under those empty barrels, covered with a layer of dirt, or invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And the implements Ruth had heard being used late at night were safely locked in the cellar below, along with 13 carefully labeled wooden boxes that contained detailed records of every man buried in that rocky field. Daniel Harrington spent another week in Georgia, interviewing anyone who would talk to him, searching for evidence that would support Ruth's claims. But everywhere he turned, he found the same story. Eleanor Cresswell was an unusual woman, certainly, but there was no proof of wrongdoing. The sales were properly documented. The buyers confirmed receiving their money's worth, at least for the slaves who actually arrived. The disappearances, while suspicious, could be explained by escape attempts. Ruth's testimony, coming from an enslaved woman with no physical evidence, thought her claims would be worthless in any legal proceeding. Frustrated, Harrington finally returned to Boston in early October. But with evidence, even his abolitionist allies were reluctant to believe them. The article was published on page 7, buried among other accounts of Southern injustice, and generated little attention. Within a month, the story was forgotten. But Eleanor didn't forget. Harrington's visit had exposed a dangerous weakness in the system. Someone Ruth obviously had talked. That meant others might talk as well. It meant her secrets were more vulnerable than she had realized. It meant she needed to accelerate her plans, to move from documentation to action before another investigator came asking questions. The night after she confirmed Harrington had left Georgia, Eleanor summoned Ruth to the main house. The old woman arrived trembling, knowing somehow that her betrayal had been discovered. Eleanor sat her down in the parlor, poured her a glass of water, and spoke in tones that were almost gentle. "You talked to the lawyer," Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question." Ruth's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold the glass. Mrs., I'm not going to. You've seen things, don't you, Dan? And you wanted someone to make it stop. Eleanor leaned forward. But I need you to understand something. What's happening at Moss Creek, it's not what you think. I'm not a monster. I'm not killing those men out of cruelty or madness. I'm building something. A weapon that will destroy the very system that enslaved you, that enslaved your parents, that will enslave your grandchildren if someone doesn't stop it. Ruth stared at her, confused and terrified. I don't understand, Mrs. Eleanor stood and retrieved the iron box from the study. She opened it, showing Ruth the coded ledgers. Every man I brought to Moss Creek was chosen for a reason. Every one of them carries blood that connects them to Georgia's most powerful family. Blood that proves what hypocrites these people are, what liars, what monsters. I've spent 16 years documenting that proof, creating an archive that will force this state, this entire region, to confront truths they've spent generations denying. She pulled out sketches she had made, detailed drawings showing facial features, measurements, comparison. Look at this man. His name was Isaac. Look at his eyes, Ruth. You know who else has eyes that exact shade of gray green? Senator Caldwell. I've seen the senator's portrait. I've studied his family. Isaac was his grandson, Ruth, the product of the senator's father raping a slave woman 40 years ago. And Isaac isn't the only one. There are 12, all carrying blood that connects them to families who claim their lineage is pure, who build their entire identity on the lie of racial superiority. Ruth's eyes widened with comprehension and horror. And you killed them. I preserved the evidence. Eleanor corrected coldly. Living men can be moved, be sold again, and disappear into the vast expanse of this country where I could never find them again. Dead men stay where I put them. Dead men can be exhumed. Their bones can be measured, examined, compared. Dead men can't deny what their bodies prove. But Mrs. whispered, that's murder. That's evil. Eleanor's face hardened. What's evil is the system that created the need for men like Isaac to exist. What's evil is a society that allows wealthy men to rape women they own, father children they'll never acknowledge, build empires on the bodies of people who declare less than human. I'm not the monster here, Ruth. I'm the reckoning. Ruth sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Finally, she asked the question that had been haunting her since Eleanor began this explanation. What about Mr. Lowe? Who is he really? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time there was something like genuine emotion in the expression. He's my son, mine and the property of a man my father once owned. That's why I understand this fight. That's why I'll never stop, because my own child exists in a world that will destroy him if they knew the truth about his father. A world that needs to burn. In that moment, Ruth understood that Eleanor was far more dangerous than she had imagined. This wasn't madness. This was something worse. A calculated, multi-decade campaign of revenge that had already claimed 13 lives and showed no signs of stopping. What are you going to do with all this? Ruth asked quietly. When? Soon, Eleanor said. The country is moving toward war. Everyone can feel it. And when that war comes, when the South is weakened and vulnerable, I'll release everything. Every name, every connection, every piece of evidence. I'll mail copies to newspapers in the North and South, to government officials, to churches. I'll make sure the entire nation knows what hypocrites built this system, what lies sustain it. And I'll do it in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed, because the evidence will be irrefutable. She closed the iron box and locked it again. But I need your silence, Ruth. I need you to understand that if you talk again, if you bring anyone else here asking questions, you won't just be endangering me. You're destroying the only chance we have to make these people pay for what they've done. Do you understand? Understood. She felt like she was drowning. She understood that understanding didn't make it right. investigator arrived with more resources than Daniel Harrington. Henry made more frequent visits to Moss Creek, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. He had closed his business in Philadelphia, he told acquaintances, and was considering relocating to the south, where opportunities seemed more abundant. No one questioned this. Plenty of Northerners were moving south in those years, drawn by cheap land and the promise of commonwealth. What they were really doing, mother and son together, was preparing for the end game. Henry had begun making copies of Eleanor's coded ledgers, translating them into plain English and storing them in different locations. A bank vault in Savannah, a lawyer's office in Charleston, with trusted contacts in Pennsylvania. They were creating redundancy, ensuring that even if Eleanor or her original documents were destroyed, the evidence would survive. They also refined their method. The cellar beneath the barn now contained not just bodies, but detailed anatomical records. Henry had studied medicine for 2 years before abandoning it for commerce, and he brought that knowledge to their work. After each killing, he would take measurements, make sketches, preserve hair samples, and, in some cases, remove specific bones that showed distinctive family traits. It was grisly work, but Henry approached it with clinical detachment. These weren't people to him. They were evidence in a case that would reshape history. By the spring of 1857, Eleanor's archive documented connections to 17 prominent Georgia families, 17 senators, judges, plantation owners, and merchants whose carefully maintained family trees concealed branches they would never acknowledge. 17 men whose political power and social standing rested on the line and their bloodlines were pure. Eleanor estimated she needed evidence connecting to at least 25 families before she would have enough leverage to create the cascade effect she wanted, where the exposure of one family would lead to questions about others, where the scandal would spread like fire through the interconnected web of Georgia's elite. She was close. Perhaps one more year of work, one more handful of carefully selected men, and she would have everything she needed. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. In April of 1857, the Charleston cotton broker arrived at Moss Creek to review her ledgers, and in those ledgers he noticed the pattern that would begin Eleanor's unraveling. The broker's name was William Thorne, and he was meticulous in the way that Eleanor had anticipated. Most buyers reviewed plantation accounts looking only at bottom-line numbers, production costs, sale prices, profit margins. Thorne examined everything. He noticed that every male slave Eleanor sold fetched prices significantly above market average. He noticed the notation, prime condition certified, appeared with suspicious consistency. And most damning, he noticed that several of the men listed as sold never appeared in subsequent records from their supposed buyers. Thorne was curious rather than suspicious. He assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Eleanor had connections with specific buyers who valued her slaves highly. Perhaps there was some training or preparation she provided that justified the premium prices. He mentioned his observations casually, expecting Eleanor to explain the pattern. Instead, he saw something flash across her face, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, that made his professional instincts ripple with alarm. It was fear, carefully concealed, instantly suppressed, but unmistakable. Eleanor Creswell was afraid of what he had noticed. Thorne left Moss Creek that afternoon, planning to make discreet inquiries. If something irregular was happening, if Eleanor was somehow manipulating her record for engaging in fraud, he had a professional obligation to investigate. More importantly, he had relationships with several of the planters listed as buyers in her ledgers. He could verify whether the slaves had actually been received, whether the transactions were legitimate. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the road and immediately sent word to Henry in Milledgeville. They met that night in the main house, and for the first time in 16 years, Eleanor felt genuine panic. He's going to check, he said, pacing the study. He's going to contact the buyers and discover the men never arrived. And then he's going to come back with authorities, or he's going to spread word that everything will unravel before we're ready. Henry stood by the window, his face reflecting in the dark glass. We stop now, he said quietly. We take what we have, 17 families, enough to cause significant damage, and we release it. Mail the copies tomorrow, send them everywhere we planned. It won't be perfect, but it will be enough. It won't, Eleanor insisted. 17 isn't enough to create the cascade we need. They'll suppress it. They'll find ways to discredit the evidence, to claim the documents are forgeries, to murder anyone who tries to investigate. We need more. We need enough connections that they can't possibly contain the scandal. Then what do you propose? Eleanor stopped pacing. Her hands, which had been trembling moments before, steadied themselves. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold certainty that had guided her through 16 years of patient work. We eliminate the problem. Thorne has noticed, but he hasn't told anyone yet. He's going to make inquiries first, verify his suspicions before making accusations. That gives us a window. A few days, perhaps a week. Henry turned from the window, his expression troubled. You're talking about killing a white man, a respectable businessman from Charleston. That's completely different from what we've been doing. The slaves. No one investigates when slaves disappear. But this, they'll hunt whoever did it. They'll tear this county apart, looking for answers. They'll hunt a runaway slave, Eleanor said. They'll hunt someone who attacked Thorne during a robbery. They'll hunt whoever we tell them to hunt. But they won't suspect me. Wealthy white men don't suspect respectable widows of murder. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor and Henry refined their plan. They learned that Thorne was staying at the Milledgeville Hotel, that he planned to spend the week visiting plantations in the area and meeting with potential clients. He was a creature of habit, Thorne. He took the same walk every evening after dinner, constitutional along the quiet road that led to the river. He walked alone, carrying a small pistol for protection, but generally unconcerned about danger. Milledgeville was civilized, he believed, not like the rougher territories where one needed to fear violence. On April 23rd, as the sun set and Thorne began his evening walk, a figure approached him from behind. The figure wore clothes stolen from Eleanor's property, rough work clothes of a field hand. His face was partially obscured by a hat pulled low. He moved with the desperate urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. What happened next would be reported in the Milledgeville newspaper as a tragic robbery. William Thorne, respected broker from Charleston, was attacked on the river road by what witnesses described as a large male slave, possibly an escapee from a nearby plantation. Thorne's pistol was fired once, but the shot went wild. He was struck repeatedly with a blunt object, later determined to be a section of wood, possibly a tree branch. His skull was fractured in 3 places. He died within minutes. His money and pocket watch were missing, taken presumably by his attacker. But curiously, his leather satchel containing business documents was left at the scene, its contents untouched. This detail struck some as odd. Why would a thief take only money and ignore valuable papers? But in the panic following the murder, the question was overlooked. A massive manhunt was organized. Every plantation within 20 miles was searched for missing slaves. Patrols scoured the countryside for days, convinced the killer must still be in the area. They found nothing. No missing slaves were reported. No witnesses came forward with useful information. The investigation eventually went cold. Another unsolved tragedy, in a region where violence was common enough, people eventually stopped asking questions. What no one knew, what no one even suspected, was that the man who killed William Thorne hadn't fled at all. He had returned to Moss Creek, removed the stolen clothes in the cellar beneath the barn, washed away the blood, and resumed his identity as Henry Lowell, respectable merchant from Philadelphia. By the time the manhunt began, he was sitting in Eleanor's parlor, calmly discussing cotton prices with a neighbor who had stopped by to pay his respects to the widow. The murder bought Eleanor time, but it also changed something fundamental in their operation. Killing the slaves had been, in Eleanor's mind, a necessary evil in service of a greater good. They were casualties in a war against an unjust system, sacrifices that would ultimately free thousands. But Thorne was different. Thorne was innocent of the system's original crimes. He was simply a man who had noticed something odd and asked questions. His death wasn't justice. It was simply murder to protect their secret. Henry felt it too. In the weeks following Thorne's death, he became quieter, more withdrawn. He still helped Eleanor with her work, still participated in their plans, but something had shifted in him. The absolute certainty that had sustained them for 16 years had developed cracks. Just when we thought the horror of Moss Creek couldn't possibly get darker, we discovered that Eleanor and Henry had crossed a line that changes everything. Their mission of exposing hypocrisy has become exactly the kind of evil they claim to oppose. If this story is giving you chills, if you're questioning whether justice can ever be achieved through such terrible means, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button if you want to support content that explores the complicated truths hidden in our past. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the shocking conclusion. Because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about Eleanor's plan. The real consequence of Thorne's murder wasn't legal. Eleanor and Henry were never suspects. succeeded. What he discovered was so disturbing that his dissertation committee initially refused to accept his findings as credible. But the evidence was there, meticulous and damning. Eleanor had documented 17 connections between enslaved men, prominent white families. She had recorded dates, physical characteristics, family history. And most chilling, she had noted which men had been preserved for evidence, a euphemism for murder. The student's dissertation, published in 1959, created a minor scandal in academic circles, but received little public attention. The families Eleanor had targeted were mostly extinct, were no longer politically powerful. The specific individuals she had murdered were unnamed in her ledgers, identified only by coded designations. Without names, without living victims to mourn, the story failed to generate the outrage Eleanor had imagined it would. What her archive did prove, what her decades of careful documentation demonstrated beyond doubt, was that the racial boundaries Southern society had claimed were sacred and inviolable were, in fact, routinely crossed by the very men who defended them most vigorously. The hypocrisy Eleanor had devoted her life to exposing was real. Her evidence was irrefutable. By the time it came to light, the world had changed so much that the revelations no longer had the power to shock. The question that haunted researchers decades afterward wasn't whether Eleanor's accusations were true. They clearly were. The question was whether her methods could ever be justified. She had murdered at least 16 people, possibly